Hey everyone, Maya here, and you're on another episode of Talky Tidbits. Now this week, I'm going to delve into a little bit more of a controversial topic. I guess maybe it's controversial here in the United States where I am. Maybe it's like that elsewhere, I don't know. But I feel it's a very important topic that maybe just needs to be discussed a little. And maybe help any of you listening out there maybe find some insight in my personal perspective on things, I guess. Okay, so actually I got the idea for this week's Talky Tidbits topic, concept, not topic, because it's Talky Tidbits, not Talky topic, right? Anyway, I got my idea for this week's discussion from something a good friend of mine and I were talking about, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's something that just needs to be addressed, I think, and something that maybe we lose sight of in all the hype to, believe in one thing or, believe what those around us are believing in and that sort of thing. So anyway, you have an idea yet? Politics, yeah. I don't really consider myself much of a politics-oriented person. I'm more of a science person. I mean, I'm studying science as a university student, and I don't plan on becoming a politician whatsoever in the future. So, but I've been thinking about the term politics and my general political attitude toward things, and I realized maybe there's a more ambiguous way to go about it. So, actually, I wrote an answer about, I responded to a question about politics on this website called Quora. I'll link it in the description below. But first off, just to give you an idea, I'm going to read my answer because I think maybe it'll kind of make things a little more clear as I read them aloud. So this is the question that I had answered, and it regards the insurrection, the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. So the question that I answered, just gotta make sure this thing's still recording because last time it didn't for some odd reason. Anyway, the question I answered was, do you think the Capitol riot was triggered more by Trump supporters' anger toward political opposition than by Trump himself? After all, blocked Twitter accounts indicate suppressed voices in democracy, and election fraud isn't entirely fake. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful of a question, but this is what I answered, and I kind of went off on a tangent, but I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest after I wrote my answer, to be honest. So this is my answer. This is definitely a change of the kinds of questions I think people would usually ask, especially concerning the January 6th riot. I will say, though, that all things considered, I don't support what happened on that day. It was unnecessarily violent, lives were lost, and it felt like maybe a loss of character emerged that day. Please note, I don't usually answer politics-oriented questions either, but I will admit that this has at least given me some kind of exercise in trying, perhaps objectively, to analyze the situation, especially since one of my liberal arts professors was able to use the riot as an example of how lyric has power, namely chanting and all those sorts of elements. Hence, I want to, for once in my life, try to step away from the anger of the situation. Again, that does not mean I support the violence that transpired. I am a pacifist by nature, and examine it for what it might be reflected as in future history texts, objectively, calmly, and with the goal being to find a resolution of some kind for the future. I've been having some deep thoughts today, and honestly, yesterday. So, real quick, I wrote this on Tuesday, and yeah, I had the thoughts about the stuff on this past Monday, which is when I started discussing it with my good friend. So, honestly, kudos to her, because I think it's really important to have a wise mindset on this sort of thing. Okay, jumping back into the answer. Feel free to disagree with me on what I'm about to say, especially if you already have a strong opinion of the people I mentioned. These words might be difficult to take, but please don't sugarcoat it. Technically, the United States is still a democracy, and in the long run, I'd much rather hear the truth than some sugar-coated sentiment. Well, I've never associated myself with one side or the other. Namely, I've been thinking, maybe politics-based discussions, at least in my life, I suppose, don't need to be assumed all polarizing and frustrating. All right, Maybe that got your attention. But here's how I look at it. When I was really young, around 6 or 7, I remember how much I used to mix up the words Democrat and Republican. To me, at the time, those two words seemed to mean two kinds of people who wanted good for the people. But then, over time, perhaps through vicarious learning and media outlets, it slowly felt that being Republican or conservative was inherently wrong, or right, depending on the person, and that being Democrat or liberal was inherently right, or similarly wrong, depending on who you are. But considering everything that's happened in the past month, can't we all, just for one moment, agree on something? We all want a happy and comfortable life. We all want to have food on the table, a bed to sleep on, a safe place to be in. We also all want to be treated kindly, to be respected, to be appreciated and loved. Mostly, I think we don't want to be angry. Maybe it feels good to have the upper hand because we get that taste of power and decide, maybe even just for an instant, that we like that flavor. But really, maybe we do it because we're struggling somehow, whether we know it or not, whether internally or externally, to attain that happy, peaceful life. Because if your life is as good as it could get for you, you wouldn't feel the urge to be angry more times than not, to lash out at people whose opinions and attitudes differ starkly from you. Most importantly, you wouldn't feel the need for hatred when your life offers proof of goodness and kindness. Nobody needs that kind of stress in their life, and frankly, I don't think we want it. Maybe in some way we are gradually engineered by the things we experience, the things we hear and see, to feel the way we feel. Because at the end of the day, we're all still human. We're all still subject to opinions and feelings that, more times than we want, cross or diverge with each other. And I say these things not to make anyone angry, not to infuriate anyone reading this, but because as a person growing up in the 21st century, I am genuinely, from a philosophical perspective, fascinated by how these things all tie into our political opinions. I want to be like that liberal arts professor I mentioned earlier, not instigating any violence or anger in my words, but instead an innate curiosity, because when you're curious about something, chances are you're going to want to understand it better, for real. I say these things as someone who is not necessarily aligned with one party or the other, with one person or the other. I say them as someone who believes in hope, kindness, justice, and so on. I like Lincoln's ideas of perseverance, and he wasn't Democratic. I also like Biden's ideas of unity, and he isn't Republican. I can like values because in their basic forms, they are not exclusive to one party. They are part of our nature as humans, part of our innate desires and longings. So, going by this logic, maybe, truthfully, I never thought I'd try saying this, maybe I can empathize somewhat with the anger of the people who stormed the Capitol. I don't have to agree with what happened, because I don't. I condone violence in general. I don't have to be a supporter like those people to empathize. I only have to ask my inner self as a human, not as a Democrat or Republican or an otherwise politically affiliated person. If I can extend some kind of understanding to people I previously tried not to understand, because I firmly believe nobody starts out full of rage like that. Every baby, everywhere in the world, is born curious and pure. It is when their environment and experiences and a bit of genetics, because I do believe in nature and nurture having an impact on one's life, emerge that they slowly adopt the mindsets and ways of thinking that they do. Every rebellion I've ever studied in history, every revolt, I always used to feel that they were justified, a sign of the people rising up and using their voices to overturn unjust government, which is really what democracy is founded on, isn't it? For the people, by the people. Again, I'm not saying the violence is right, but for once, I want to try to view this situation objectively, not subjectively with all my previous attitudes and forceful opinions. In other words, I want to view this situation like a young child who has no idea of political ideologies, but who wants to understand the logic of both sides, like a mediator. So maybe those people felt angry, obviously, because what they wanted to see didn't happen. Maybe, no, there should be people who stood behind values, not just the candidates. Perhaps this is another stereotype of recent years, believing that people support one candidate because of that candidate's character only, not, as probably is the case for many out there, because of the values that seem to be upheld by said candidate. Maybe. Just some food for thought. I'll admit, for example, that I didn't think much of Trump when he was elected in 2016. Granted, I didn't know much about him or of politics in general. What mattered to me was whether I was safe, whether my family and friends were safe, etc. By that I mean, could I go to bed at night knowing the people I loved were still alive and able to do what we'd always done before the election? As long as my immediate circle of humans, my tribe, I guess you could call it, were okay, then I could be okay too. No political knowledge involved. Sort of like how animals might be regarding politics. Are they themselves okay at the end of the day? If so, then we move forward with the day and live to see another day. I honestly still feel this way about politics, even now. If my family and friends are doing all right still, at the end of the day, that is why I can sleep without unease, because I know they are still alive and well, for the most part. Again, think in terms of how a young child who has no understanding or interest whatsoever in politics might see the situation. If mommy and daddy and my friends are okay, then I'll be okay too. Life is a struggle. Life is a miracle. Life is a mixed bag. I think we all realize that at some point, and that's the key behind it. We all realize this something. So I'm not saying I support Trump. I'm also actually not saying I support Biden either. Yes, I voted for Biden for the 2020 election, but I am still what you'd call undecided because I don't affiliate myself with one party or the other. Right now, I simply feel Biden's policies might protect my family more than Trump's have. But in 2016, I felt Trump's policies would be better than Clinton's because what mattered to me was, again, the safety of my family. And whoever had ideals I felt in the moment would support that safety earned my support. But it's not a set-in-stone type of mindset I hold. I know not every Democrat will deserve my vote in the future, nor will every Republican necessarily not deserve my vote, hence my non-party affiliation. I'm ambiguous in that zone. What I support are the values that Biden wants to implement. But 4 or 5 years ago, I actually cheered when I learned Trump was elected, not because of who he was, but because of the ideas he brought up, like valuing national defense and priorities. Key here, ideals, not person. And to paraphrase something I heard recently, patriotism means at its core roots standing by the democracy and the soul of this country. More broadly, standing by the values of one's country, not, listen carefully, of one's president. So, like it or not, I guess even I have to realize maybe empathy could be a game changer in understanding politics. And I mean this with all seriousness. I imagine on the flip side, if I was a fervent supporter of someone, but was blocked from using my voice to express my beliefs, I'd feel no differently from people who have been prejudiced or shunned throughout history, unable to be heard. And on a personal level, I actually get that. It hurts not to be heard. But at the same time, this is where my considering both sides mentality tries to work things out. I think the way we use our words is of more consequence in the long run than of simply whether we use them in the first place. And regarding all these statements that we've heard as claims or lies, perhaps there is truth behind them somewhat. For example, take voter fraud, which many people have had conflicting ideas on. We can use that as a mental exercise in talking about polarizing topics, though, can we not? On the one hand, I trust the process of repetition. Certain states, for this past election, had their votes recounted to strengthen the accuracy. And in the past 2 decades, very little fraud in the United States has been reported. Okay? And on the other hand, I recognize that voter fraud is not fake. It has happened. It does truly and completely happen. Honestly, this topic, electoral fraud, makes me think of my anxiety whenever someone in my house puts a glass cup on the edge of the counter, the table, etc. Because I know the odds are nothing bad is going to happen, but I still know that glass cups have been broken. I've heard them break, I've seen them break. So I can't ignore the impending threat of this glass cup breaking too. Compare this quirky example to voter fraud. Maybe, just maybe, that analogy between the two isn't quite so crazy. If you take away your anger and attitude toward politics for just 1 minute of your life, can you imagine that analogy? As though you're a small child again, who understands close to nothing about politics or ideologies. Point aside, from a philosophical standpoint, this is more of a fascinating discussion than frustrating, I think. I just feel when we try to emulate the easy-to-come-by feeling of getting angry at those with different political views, do we really get any closer to a kinder, ideal world that we want? Like with my little sister and me. If we work together without fighting over what we disagree on, say favorite foods, then and only then can peace and tranquility become a stronger part of our lives. Otherwise, we'd go to bed filled with hatred and too much bad energy in our minds and souls, so to speak. Well, that's my take on it anyway. Further, ask a little kid what their idea of a wonderful world is, and chances are you'll get a response of a place where we can all be happy with each other, learn some things from each other, and most importantly, see kindness among big people and not just kids. One more thing I want to add. This whole approach reminds me of how polarizing attitudes tend to define a feminist. When I was younger, I used to despise the term feminist because of how I thought it was. Per the media, usually enraged women shouting a lot. But really, at its core values and ideals, a feminist is someone who supports equality for all genders, drawing from women's rights. And really, I'd just been hopping on the bandwagon, adopting the attitudes that most people seem to take, i.e. that feminists were off their rocker, when really, deep down, I thought feminism was a cool movement for equality and all that jazz. And so I think even now, that's why sometimes people might be covert about their beliefs, because it seems, at least here in the United States, that there's already some kind of predetermined attitude toward different groups, be it related to politics, music, movies, people, etc. So even if you're just genuinely trying to support certain values here and certain values there through the politics, music, movies, people you support, you end up labeled as something that you wouldn't otherwise label yourself as. Consider the stereotype of a conservative versus a liberal, for example, or the stereotype of listening to certain musicians versus others. I admit, this is why Japanese music appealed to me more as an American citizen. I didn't have that predetermined attitude toward Japanese music that I had to otherwise deal with when listening to English music. Why are we defining people with one word? It's ridiculous. Humans are complex beings, so, like with feminism, I firmly believe in the power of stepping away from those kinds of tactics and instead just being happy to embrace the values I do, because at the end of the day, I really don't care what party those values are associated with. In other words, from my end anyway, values are enduring, transcending time and space. Labels are shallow, a reflection of society's attempt to play games with our minds, our interactions, and our souls. So make the values crystal clear and ditch the labels. And that, I think, is how politics will revamp our mindsets in the years to come. Okay. That was a really long answer, wasn't it? I just had to make sure this thing's still recording. But yeah, that's my perspective on it. So I know it's probably a lot to take in, and for me it's certainly been a lot to take in because over recent years I felt like I've been subconsciously maybe leaning toward being more of a Democratic type person, but really when I think about it, I still remember how I used to confuse those terms, Democrat and Republican. And I'll just give you an example. I've got friends who are liberal, and I've got friends who are conservative. And neither of them are crazy people like sometimes how news outlets tend to portray it. Like one of my closest friends is a retired librarian, and her best friend, I've gotten to know her best friend, who is also a retired librarian. And this friend, the retired librarian friend of the first retired librarian, well, she posted something on her Facebook page the other week that I found really inspiring. And it basically went something like this, like back in the old days when we voted for real Democrats and Republicans here in the U.S., we didn't vote for the people. We voted for the ideas, for the beliefs that we stood for. And so I commented on her post and I said, I've been thinking that too, because I think of how I used to confuse the terms when I was little, and at the end of the day, we all want the same things. And so really it should just boil down to what values, what morals we support. And she agreed with me, and she, I think she voted for Trump. So, we voted for different people, but that doesn't really matter, because I think half the time when people vote for something, they're voting for that person because they think that person will uphold the values they themselves believe in, right? So I talked a little bit in that answer how I felt 4 or 5 years ago when I didn't really understand much of politics, and how at the end of the day I just wanted my family and my friends safe and alive and happy, okay? That's really all I want. And I think about it this way. If if you told me, if someone who lives in another country was telling me about their country's political atmosphere, I would not have a clue of how to understand the different parties in that country. So I wouldn't try to understand it. Instead, I would ask myself, what has that person done from a moral perspective, not a political perspective? So I'm not considering parties here. Does it seem like the right approach, the right path? Like I'm just going to give an example, like a really easy example. Like let's say in some distant country, and this isn't only for me, you can use this as an exercise too if you're still listening to this. If someone who lives in another country, in a different country from you, if that person tells you that, okay, maybe there's like 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, different groups, different parties of people, and they try to tell you, one seems to be a lot better than the other, or one seems to be a lot worse than the others, how are you going to take that in? And I don't know about you, fellow listeners, but for me, I prefer to, first off, not confuse myself with different party labels, because for one thing, I'm not going to have any prior knowledge of this other country's politics, this other country's government, how its government and politics works, okay? So what I would think, I would do my research on how these people in the groups seem to be over different periods of time. And I would ask myself, do they seem to be people that would uphold and support those values that might be, that are important, like, supporting the country's values. And, even by that, justice, fairness, equality, stuff like that. And so really when it comes down to it, I think even after last year's election here in the United States, I think this is why I cannot totally isolate myself from politics like I used to, because I kind of understand it a little bit better. I think the past year has helped me kind of scratch the surface at the crux of politics, so to speak. And so really it's just from here on out keeping a wise and careful mindset about examining and trying to understand the political atmosphere better, because I think I know how it feels to be someone who is bored by it, but at the same time, when you realize that, I think it does concern you, because it is how the place you live in is being governed, how the place you live in is being run and being overseen and being protected. It concerns all those things, so I think that's why it's an important thing in life, really, to just listen and be aware, and maybe to see the things that maybe nobody else sees. And by that, I don't mean go off on a tangent with some crazy theory or whatever, but I mean, like, just genuinely listen. Like, put aside the attitudes and the ideas of certain parties versus other parties. Just think of what morals, at the end of the day, you support. Having a safe place to live, having food on the table, making sure everyone you love is happy and healthy and safe and alive, things like that. And I think that's how politics could really be a really good exercise for helping your mentality with this sort of concept, because it is a very complicated topic, I think. And another thing I want to mention is that in case it feels like I'm being too ambiguous, I'll just be very clear right now then on the kinds of things I do not support. Now, considering the people I mentioned, the politicians I mentioned in my answer, you may have some idea of who I'm referring to or some idea of whom I'm not referring to, and that's fine if you do. But just know I'm going to be very firm right now about what I do not support. I do not support prejudice of any kind. I am multiracial myself, and I find it extremely offensive that people are still being, that some people out there today still support racial prejudice and racial discrimination. I think it is a horrifying thing to judge someone just because their skin color is different from yours. I think it is a very ridiculous thing. And actually, one time, I'm going to link this in the description too, actually, now that I think about it. I wrote a similar answer on Quora before that was basically about, like, what is my attitude toward racial discrimination, and this is what I described it as. If you have an aquarium full of different kinds of frogs that are all different kinds of colors, how ridiculous would it be to start judging them based on their colors? I mean, yeah, that sounds ridiculous because we're doing it to frogs, but you realize that's what people are doing to people when they discriminate, when they are prejudiced, okay? So we are clear on that. I do not support prejudice or discrimination. I dislike it with a very fervent emphasis on the dislike. And similarly, I do not support or like in any way people who are misogynist. So, you know, people that think men are better than women or that sort of thing. I don't like that attitude because, especially since I am growing up with a little sister, and that I have been growing up with a little sister and the kind of values that she is learning of in the world today, and especially considering that our current vice president is now a girl, and I've seen over the last few weeks how my sister finds that extremely inspirational, and I think of how harsh it would be if one day, say, she would be treated differently just because she is a woman and not a man. And I find that ridiculous. People would also judge other people based on that gender-based thing. Another thing, though I am not myself directly involved in these sorts of communities, I do empathize and support I don't know what they call it in other countries, but I know here, well, just in general, I hope I get all the letters right, LGBTQ plus community. So I support those because I think at the end of the day, love is just love. And I really, again, like with the other things, I find it ridiculous if someone would be treated poorly just because of minute aspects of their character like that. I mean, that's just part of who they are. And that's all I'm going to say on that. That should make it clear. And for the record, I think one thing my good friend who inspired this topic for this week mentioned, just the idea that there are only two genders in the world. You know, growing up, I admit I used to think that too, but I feel like we're growing up in a very changing world, and so I'm always trying to be open to the fact that, maybe I don't understand everything about what I see. So I hope to kind of understand that better. But on the same note, because I know sometimes, for me personally, this has come up in conversation, sometimes I face controversy with my talk of being open-minded because I don't support certain things that you would think are open-minded. I'm not going to name any names or name any specific things, but just as a general standard, regardless of whatever controversy it brings about here in the United States, I do not support drug usage, period. I don't care what it is. My motto is, I concern this in terms of health, not in terms of politics or parties or sides or whatever. I concern this as part of my moral. And my moral motto for this is, if you don't need it in your body when you are a kid, you certainly do not need it in your body when you are a fully grown adult, period. And I know some people have disagreed with me on that whenever the topic comes up in conversation. And naming no names, I will say, sometimes I have been accused of not being very open-minded in the sense that I condemn drug usage, but at this point I really don't care, because I feel that whether or not I support that sort of thing or whether or not I condemn it should not be a point of politics. It should not be a point of how open-minded I am. It should be a point of how much I value a person's health. And so my motto is, again, if you don't need that kind of junk in your body when you are a baby, in other words, if you can survive as a baby, if you can survive as a human being for the first 10 years of your life without that stuff, why can't you survive the rest of your life without it, once you're an adult? So that's all I've got to say. So I know I made this episode extra long, and I know it's probably, maybe for certain people who listen to it, maybe it sparked a bit of controversy, maybe a little bit of anger, but like I mentioned in the answer I was reading, don't sugarcoat it. I don't want you to sugarcoat your feelings toward this. the country I live in is still technically democracy, but at the same time, I want to be very firm with my personal perspectives, my personal morals, even regarding my political ambiguity. So yeah, I know this is a lot to take in, but I've been really honestly looking forward to talking about this because I feel it's one of those things that I think people realize we do need to talk about, but they just don't because it feels like too much of a taboo topic or too much of a very heated discussion. But I think it's something important to discuss and think about as you try to figure out who you are in your life. And honestly, this has helped me understand more about who I am as a person. So it's been really great. And again, kudos to that friend who inspired this conversation, because politics is not something I would openly discuss, but I've actually felt moved and encouraged very much this week to put forth my thoughts and hopefully maybe give some of you listeners some insight into the topic. So yeah, until next time, Tidbits out.